World War II was full of new and improved weapons. The development of armaments such as nuclear warheads at the end of the war changed the way conflicts are fought. However, there were some other, more obscure megaprojects, which also permanently changed warfare, especially in Germany. Hitler, as an individual, loved to emphasize large structures and weapons. To him, bigger was better. Among these large-scale projects, of which some never left the drawing board, was the German rocket program. One of the few megaprojects that gained more attention, the rocket program was groundbreaking, yet it also sped up the demise of the Nazi regime. Numerous production facilities were made during World War II, both underground and on the surface. These facilities reflect Hitler's desire to develop armaments that would result in total destruction and absolute success. Two facilities in particular were used for developing the V-2 rocket, Peenemünde and Mittelwerk. During early development phases, Peenemünde was chosen by the head of the Nazi rocket program, Wernher von Braun, as an out-of-place region on the Baltic coast, away from prying eyes.
And that was picked because it was very desolate, and they could set sensors along this fairly straight coast, which helped in monitoring the trajectory of the tests.
Peenemünde was not your average secret military research center. It was an incredibly advanced facility for its time, holding the many things necessary for rocketry.
Due to the scale at which things would be built, and the massive amounts of fuel needed to power the rockets, Peenemünde required an immense amount of power. So, Wernher had an entire power plant built inside.
Thousands of workers were sent to build Peenemünde, a feat in and of itself. Upon completion, it had everything that Wernher needed to build his rockets.
Wernher's ultimate goal was space exploration, and that was what he told everyone. As a child, Wernher became fascinated in rockets and spaceflight. This led him to become involved in the German Society for Space Travel in 1928. However, he aimed to further expand, building and designing bigger and better rockets. This culminated with him joining the German army in 1932, working to develop liquid fuel rockets. For him, this was a major opportunity, since it was fully army-funded research. But this advantage also brought about its own challenges. Wernher had to produce a product for Hitler in his campaign, and funding heavily depended on showing progress and displaying to the Führer that it was worthwhile. Hitler later ended up delaying the decision to put the V-2 into production for 3 years, possibly due to difficulties in its development. Unfortunately for Wernher, the true reality of the situation was that the missiles were intended to kill, not to send to space. The Germans called the V-2 rocket the A4 rocket, the fourth in 5 rockets used to develop and perfect the V-2. It all began with secret experimental tests made between 1932 and 1934 on smaller rockets, designated the A1 and the A2. After 2 A2s were successfully flown at the end of 1934, development of the A3 began, and it was developed and tested from 1935 through 1937, ultimately providing 3 times the thrust than its predecessor. Finally came the A4, one of Germany's projected Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapons. This rocket was first proposed 1 year prior to the finishing development of the A3 rocket, and was a major scale-up, going all the way from 3,300 pounds of thrust in the A3 rocket to 56,000 pounds. The designing stage of the A4 occurred during 1939 through 1941, but it took all the way to near the end of the war to make the rocket usable.
There was development, but not a lot, because they were only used for 6-7 months.
When Wernher was first recruited to develop liquid fuel rockets for the German army, little to no work had been done on this kind of technology, and only the most rudimentary of pressure-fed, water-cooled combustion chamber rockets had been fired.
These basic liquid fuel rockets generated minimal thrust for very short periods of time. But the resourceful Wernher managed to bring about success in 2 years with the A2 rocket, which had 5 times the amount of thrust generated previously. However, another problem arose. This design still used a primitive cooling method that was not sufficient for their purposes. Hence came the A3 3 years later. This rocket was supposed to be a scaled-down version of the V-2 rocket, but it still used the same cooling method and was ultimately a miserable failure. In fact, the control system and the aerodynamics were so messed up that the detailed design for the A4 rocket was postponed until it could be made to work in an even more updated, scaled-down design, the A5.
Ultimately, it took 7 years of trial and error to produce a perfected rocket engine.
This was cutting-edge technology. Werner von Braun, the father of German rocketry, got his PhD in 1934, and it wasn't until 1944 that they successfully launched V-2 rockets. They'd launched smaller rockets before that, but it took a long time. There were many, many failures.
Unfortunately, even more troubles came to plague Werner and his team. Every attempt to scale up the engine to the thrust required for the size of the A4 rocket always brought about combustion instability problems. Eventually, an incredibly complex design was found as a solution, and was added into production. But despite all this trouble, the method of thrust for the A4 ended up being successful and was nothing short of brilliant.
Starting at the top, there is the warhead, then there is a control compartment, then you'll see 2 large tanks. The upper tank is alcohol and water, the lower tank is liquid oxygen. Below that is a big pump that pumps these fuels down into a combustion chamber where the fuel is ignited and then the rocket plume goes out the bottom.
The fuel was pumped into a combustion chamber using rotary pumps driven by steam created from the auxiliary fuels. The combustion inside the chamber produced extreme heat, which was cooled by circulating liquid ethanol. The hot gases generated powerful thrust when they expanded through the rocket's nozzle. This thrust would last the rocket approximately 60 seconds, enough time for the rocket to reach speeds of 3,400 miles per hour and distances of 220 miles, making it the first supersonic rocket ever. But before these kind of results were seen, hundreds of tests had to be run to redevelop the aerodynamics and control system for the V-2. Little theory and no practical experience in supersonic aerodynamics meant that trial and error was the only method of improvement, an incredibly slow and painful approach. Additionally, there were no computers or programs to simulate the rocket's flight, so every test had to be done on a fully built rocket, which was incredibly expensive, time-consuming, and an impractical practice, but the only method available. It took a whole 10 years after development of liquid fuel rockets had started for the first test A4 to be launched.
It took a long time to get these to work right. There are lots of films of these, blowing up or going hardly any distance and blowing up. So the main technology didn't really come together until about the middle of the war.
Even then, many more problems plagued the rockets, resulting in an 80% failure rate due to mysterious in-flight disintegrations. This was discovered to be an issue with the shell of the rocket unable to withstand the forces from supersonic flight. The last of the fixes to the missile were not introduced into the production line until late 1944, close to the end of the war. In 1943, 1 year prior, a wrench was thrown in German plans. Great Britain had heard of talk from imprisoned German officials of rockets, and flying objects had been sighted off the Baltic coast. A scouting mission revealed that the Germans were truly building rockets at Peenemünde, and Operation Hydra commenced, where the British launched a 596 bomber attack on the rocket facility. Peenemünde was leveled to the ground. Werner managed to escape, but a new facility had to be built. This time, the production facility was chosen to be made underground, invisible from surveillance aircraft. Thus came Mittelbau, a word which describes a collection of factories, storage depots, facilities, and prisoner camps, some underground, that were used to build the V-2s. It was from here that the rest of the V-2s were produced.
Overall, the V-2 rocket program cost at least $2 billion in 1944 dollars. This was an incredibly large sum, so the German government must have seen something beneficial from this program. One such benefit they foresaw was that the rocket would impact with supersonic velocity with little warning to the inhabitants. Most cities had a siren that would alert the common people of incoming bombs, giving them time to run to bomb shelters. But the V-2 was not a regular bomb or missile. It had a high parabolic path, much greater speed, and less noise. It was like a stealth rocket, attacking without much warning, destroying the morale of the Allies, and leaving a devastating effect on the infrastructure of the locations it hit.
It really could only hit big areas, so they were for use against London and then cities, particularly in Belgium. Antwerp was a big target.
Additionally, it was displayed to the public as incredibly dangerous, accurate, and powerful.
The V-2 was so fast, it was impossible to intercept, and so the only successful countermeasure used against the V-2 was espionage.
This technological advancement showed the world that the Germans were superior and helped fuel German propaganda to its citizens, that they would have a high chance of winning. During the war, the Allies were forced to divide their resources to make combat missions in order to destroy the V-2 launch site. All these resources could have been used elsewhere if not for the danger that the V-2 posed. Interestingly, the reality of the situation was that the V-2 was not insanely dangerous to people.
But in general, if you average it out, these only killed 2 or 3 people each.
But despite the low level of casualties, the size of the rocket and its potential to greatly impact or possibly alter the war agitated the Allies. And in truth, the Germans did try their very best to get the rocket to work optimally, going as far as using different paint jobs for different scenarios.
You're probably more familiar with a black and white kind of scheme. That was on the experimental rockets. It was so that they could track them, and in the films they could see how they were maneuvering. And then as they started to use them operationally, they were being fired from all over the countryside, so they gave them camouflage so they couldn't be seen from the air. And then later on in the war, they, out of desperation and nowhere to hide, they stopped painting them altogether.
Though this rocket seemed so frightening, it was in fact deadlier to put together than even its use during the war. The majority of deaths caused by the V-2 rocket was not the death toll in cities, but in production of the rocket. The Middlework underground factory that produced the majority of the rockets required a massive workforce to be efficient. Hitler wanted more and more V-2s, as fast as possible. But there was a major issue. Most of the able men were out fighting in the war, and there was a scarcity of not only skilled labor, but labor in general. Due to this, the German SS officers resorted to free labor, that of concentration camps. One of those prisoner camps was Dora, and it was placed close to the underground area that would become Middlework. The prisoners from this camp were used to dig under a mountain and build the factory, as well as construct the rockets. As expected, conditions were horrible. Anyone who couldn't continue to work was beaten or murdered. Inadequate food was provided, and hygiene was awful. By the end of only one winter, 3,000 prisoners had died, and another 3,000 lay ill or dying.
And sadly, the use of concentration camp inmates to produce these weapons probably resulted in about 20,000 people losing their lives.
The explosions of the rocket itself killed approximately 9,000 Allied civilians and military personnel, with the vast majority of casualties being civilians, since they and their morale was the target. But nothing compared to the torturous environment of the underground facility at Middlework. The vast majority of those tragedies and atrocities were hidden when America tried to capture and preserve the technology that was astounding the world. During the decade before World War II, Albert Einstein, a famous scientist, moved to America. Einstein's brilliance was used for the creation of the first atomic bomb. With the atomic bomb and the V-2 rocket both created by German scientists, it was evident that the Germans were virtually at the top of the technology chain. However, America wanted to be on that top, and subsequently executed Operation Paperclip.
There was a program in the US called Operation Paperclip, whose goal was to get German aerospace technology and German scientists and bring them to this country and to utilize them and their knowledge. And so I don't think there's any doubt that that gave the United States an incredible jump on initially making intercontinental ballistic missiles early in the Cold War, and then developing the space program. Because Germany had the most advanced rocketry in the 1930s and 40s, and the United States. The other allies got a little bit of the action, but the US got most of the people and most of the hardware.
At the end of World War II, Germany had been split into several controlled regions. One such was controlled by America, but another was controlled by the Soviets. America wanted to obtain as much of the powerful German technology as possible, but they encountered an issue. Many of the factories were located in the Soviet-controlled region of Germany. Consequently, during the final moments of the war, the US quickly sent teams to extract secret files and technology that the Germans had left, before the Soviets went to take them. One such place, Middlework, was where the United States confiscated much of the new V-2 technology that Germans had been working on. Along with these technologies, the Americans, as part of Operation Paperclip, brought hundreds of German scientists and their families to the United States to work on rockets or other such space technology programs. One of these scientists, Wernher von Braun, who was an SS officer and the brains behind the V-2, directly surrendered to the US and was instrumental in the technological development of the US rockets for space exploration. Though he visited Middlework, where the vast majority of internees that worked on the V-2 died, he never oversaw the atrocities committed there. But the dangers in Nazi Germany were quite real, even for himself, and thus Wernher was quite willing to surrender to the Americans. But there was a major issue. The vast majority of these scientists were Nazis. How could America know if the hundreds of German scientists were still loyal to Germany? They couldn't. Thus the operation continued, despite the ethical problems associated with it. A list called List 1 was made that contained hundreds of names of scientists to kidnap or arrest and bring to America for use. People such as Arthur Rudolph, who oversaw and enforced the horrible atrocities at Middlework, had their criminal files erased in order to be brought to America. Many Nazis in this manner escaped justice.
Our first activity, when I say ours, I mean mine and that of the 120 associates from Peenemünde I was permitted to bring along to the United States, was to fire V-2s in White Sands.
As Operation Paperclip continued, the Cold War began. With German rocketry as a foundation, both the Soviets and Americans began to experiment and create new technology.
The V-2 was incredibly important in the development of rocketry, both military rocketry and civilian rocketry. Before the V-2, other rockets were a lot of rocket research was going on, but most of the rockets were about the size of you and me. The V-2 program was the first to produce a large rocket that could be used for war or for space exploration, so it was incredibly important.
The V-2 rocket's successes showed that the ICBMs were actually a possibility, and in the following decades, the technology of V-2 propulsion, guidance mechanism, and design principles were the basis for advancements in ICBMs. One such example was the Soviet R-7 Semyorka, which copied the liquid rocket engine design and had similar guidance and control systems. However, no matter how groundbreaking the V-2 technology was, it still had not solved issues of stability. At supersonic speeds, stability was crucial for flight control. At 5 times the speed of sound and an apex of over 100 miles, additional technology would be needed to examine what would affect rockets at those high speeds and such unique environments. The V-2's technology provided a foundation for advancements in understanding flight control systems at higher pressures, and stability in supersonic speeds and high altitudes, enabling research to blaze forward. But not only was the V-2 technology used to advance weapons, it was also used to advance scientific research. One example would be Project Hermes, which utilized the missile launching ground at White Sands, New Mexico, to fire V-2 rockets such that the environment at high altitudes could be analyzed. However, the ultimate goal, Wernher von Braun's goal, was to understand everything required to send humans safely into space and onto the moon. This vision brought about the need for further advancements such as in space medicine, something crucial to ensure the safety of anyone flying into space. The V-2 provided a way for the testing of living organisms at high altitudes and extreme speeds. It helped to determine information about developing life support systems for the challenging aspects of human spaceflight. Initially, fruit flies were used for these tests due to their small size and ease of handling, though tests did eventually include rats and monkeys. On September 20th, 1951, all the mice sent up on a V-2 rocket survived, signifying the success of maintaining life on a trip into space. Though the V-2 was marred by its dark origins, it continues to impact today's technology. Being the first ever ballistic missile and space-visiting rocket, as well as being the first liquid fuel-propelled rocket, the V-2 marked a turning point in the history of rocket technology. Among other things, it sparked the extensive growth of countless new ideas after World War II and during the Cold War. From it, the Saturn V won the space race for America. And it was in fact developed by none other than the creator of the V-2, von Braun himself. Rocketry development flourished under the brilliant eye of German scientists like Wernher von Braun, who played a pivotal role in advancing the field. The V-2 rocket, a testament to their brilliance, stands as a landmark in the history of rocketry and spaceflight, forever entwined with their achievements.